Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my good friend and fellow native Mainer, Ryan T. Quint. Ryan, how are you?
Good. Good. How are you? I
See,
saw
I'm going
that.
to put on
How
my
are you?
Canadian. How
Yeah.
are
How are
you?
you? Yeah, that's right.
Fine, thanks. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I was on a tour the other day, and there was a New Englander on my tour, and I used the phrase "wicked far," wicked far away, and they laughed, but nobody else did. I was like, well, there's the joys of a regional joke.
That's right. That's right.
So,
We're going to talk a little bit about Maine today. And coming up for the Emerging Civil War Symposium, we're talking about the cities of war. Ryan had a couple really good stories from the city of Portland, Maine, or Portland. And so I thought we'd have him come on here and talk a little bit about a place we don't really think of as a front on the during the war, but Portland actually has some pretty good history to it. So,
oh, for
first of
sure.
all, tell us a little bit about your association with Maine.
Okay, I was born there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it starts there, right? As all stories should. I was born in Portland. Um, My family has have lived in Maine for generations upon generations. I have Civil War ancestors who served in Maine regiments. So we go way back. I came to Virginia and everybody else stayed there. I have an aunt in Virginia Beach, but everybody else is still up in Maine. They're still kicking it. They came over from Scotland. They came down from Canada. However they got there, they got to Maine. So that's my connection. Grew up in Maine, graduated high school, and then said bye. But no matter, I've lived in Virginia for about 13 years now, but I'll always call Maine home. So
There's a lot less snow shoveling here in Virginia than there was back home.
significantly,
Yeah.
yeah, significantly. So
Now, some people may be surprised to know that there's more to Maine than the 20th Infantry Regiment. What do
go
you like
figure.
about Maine's role in the Civil War?
The fact that it does go beyond just a regiment or a person, right? Uh, Maine sends thousands to fight in the war, and so it's up there with states of per capita, right? Per capita, Maine has some of the most troops serving in the Union, and so the fact that you have all of these people leaving from all sorts of Maine, Portland or higher up, Portland's in the southern part of the state, but northern Maine, they're all in it, and they're pretty hardcore. So you've got stories of Mainers at almost every major Civil War battlefield you can think of. There is a main unit there doing something. Um, People like Joshua Chamberlain, sure, they control the radio waves, but you also have O.O. Howard, the highest ranking Maine officer during the Civil War, Major General. Hiram Berry killed at Chancellorsville from Maine, right? Rockland, Maine. So yeah, lots of stories, lots of people, lots of interest for sure.
Yeah. And Maine does see some conflict that a lot of people don't realize. So we'll start our kind of our storytelling there. There's a naval battle in Portland Harbor. Tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, so how's that happen? June 27th, 1863, which means it's immediately overshadowed by the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Um, but the story starts not in Maine, but off the coast of Brazil, actually, in May 1863, when a young Confederate lieutenant, Charles Reed, gets this idea. He's serving on a Confederate ship. They had just captured. They're kind of patrolling off international waters, kind of attacking U.S. shipping and things like that. And Reed captures one of these ships. And Reed was a Naval Academy graduate, and kind of has this can-do attitude, right? And his friends call him "savve," which is kind of the French verb to know. And for whatever reason, Reed just loves this word, savvy this, savvy that. And so they call him Savvy Reed. And his idea is if his captain will allow him, he'll take a small crew onto this ship, a U.S. ship, fly it under a false flag into the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, and steal a U.S. gunboat. And they'll sail that back, or they'll steam that back to Confederate controlled territory. And the captain says, I'm curious to see where this will take you. So go for it. And so he does. Reed starts to sail north, and as he makes his way north around Brazil and through the waters off Mexico and then past Florida, he is attacking ships as he goes. And what he's doing is he's basically bonding them, almost like an IOU to the Confederate government, and keeps getting closer to Virginia. And by the time he gets to Hampton Roads, he realizes his plan is woefully undercooked, right? The U.S. Navy is in full strength at Hampton Roads, right? The Atlantic Blockade Squadron is there, and there's no way in hell he's going to make his way into Hampton Roads. So he says, "All right, we got a good thing going. Let's keep going." And so he's going now up through Pennsylvania and up past New York, and he's still attacking these ships. He attacks like 20 ships from May to late June. Um, Keeps releasing these prisoners, and he's not by himself. He's being chased by Union ships that have caught wind of what he's trying to do. And so every now and then, to evade capture, he will switch to a different ship and he'll burn the one he had been on, almost like the U.S. Navy is chasing a ghost ship because they can't find it. And finally, that's what's going to bring him off the coast of Maine in June of 1863. He sails past the Portland Headlight, right, one of the more famous landmarks in the state of Maine. And what Reed's plan is he's going to leave his main ship off the coast of Portland, kind of just out of sight, and then he's going to take a small, maybe like a rowboat side squadron, row that into Portland in the middle of the night, and he's going to capture a U.S. revenue cutter, kind of a precursor to the Coast Guard, called the Caleb Cushing. The Caleb Cushing was docked in Portland. Reed was going to take it, sail it out, and then the two of them, the Caleb Cushing and the ship he came from, would sail back to Confederate waters. And as timing happened, the captain of the Caleb Cushing dies of a heart attack on June 26th, 1863. So most of the crew of the Caleb Cushing are in Portland on shore leave or are burying their dead captain, leaving behind just a lieutenant and a couple of guys left on the Caleb Cushing. And so rows Reed and his contingent. Reed jumps on board the Caleb Cushing to the surprise of this crew, and he says, "I claim this ship in the name of the Confederacy." Okay. The lieutenant of the Caleb Cushing was a Georgian, Deadly Davenport, which is just a fantastic name. Um, and Reed is like, "You ought to be ashamed, right? You're a Georgian fighting for the United States, and all that kind of happens." But Davenport hides the key to the gun pack, the powder magazine of the Caleb Cushing. So Reed can't get access to any of the ship's guns. The Caleb Cushing as a revenue cutter had basically a howitzer mounted on the bow of the ship, but nothing else, right? It was mainly designed to cut down smugglers and things like that. So Reed has to take some time to build up some momentum to get this ship out of the harbor. He's got to wait for the tides to leave and all that. So he's losing precious time. But he does start to sail the Caleb Cushing out of Portland's harbor. And then up comes the customs inspector for the port of Portland, a guy named Jedediah Jewett, another pretty awesome name.
Yeah,
Um,
Jedediah is a good one.
he's got his little clipboard and he's checking all of his ships. And he's like, "Well, hold on a minute. There's one ship that should be here that's not here anymore." And he realizes the Caleb Cushing, for whatever reason, has left the harbor. And Jewett's first thought is Dudley Davenport, the Georgian lieutenant, has decided to switch sides and he's
Oh,
stealing the Caleb Cushing. And so he starts to raise the alarm, and church bells are going off, and fire bells are going off, and people are turning out thinking there's a fire, right? We'll get to that later.
yeah.
Um, they think there's a fire, and Jewett and the town mayor explain to everybody they stole the ship. It's right there. You can see it in the harbor. We got to go after them. And so the town's population turns out. They outfit a side wheel steamer with cotton bales on the side of the ship to protect it. Everybody's grabbing their squirrel gun and their shotgun and whatever they got. And we got to go chase them down. While that kind of yakety sax comedy is going on, there's a contingent of U.S. regulars posted in Portland Harbor at a place called Fort Preble, which you can still go to today. It's near the campus of Southern Maine Community College. And the regulars had been sent home after fighting in the Eastern Theater. They had fought at Fredericksburg, they'd fought at Chancellorsville about a month earlier. So they're on leave, they're on recruiting leave. And now all of a sudden, here comes this word that they got to chase down some Confederates. Um, and so the garrison of Fort Preble, the 17th U.S. Infantry, turns out, loads up their own gunboat, and starts to chase the Caleb Cushing. So, if the Pirates of the Caribbean theme music swells to a pitch, you've got the Caleb Cushing being chased by what's called the Forest City and the Chesapeake, and they're chasing down Caleb Cushing. Cushing realizes he's not going to be able to outrun these side wheel steamers. They're under steam. He's at the mercy of the sail and the winds. And so he realizes he's not going to be able to outrun them. And what he wants to do is go down swinging, right? So he gets this howitzer on the ship and he starts to bomb. He starts to shoot at the ships pursuing him. The Forest City, which has all these civilians on it, they're like, "What the? No, this is not our bailiwick. This is not in the job description." And so they peel off. The U.S. regulars steam ahead, continuing to get closer to the Caleb Cushing, and Reed runs out of ammunition. Right? Remember, Davenport, who had in fact not switched sides, hid the key to the powder magazine, so Reed only has a couple of shots. And so Reed decides to abandon ship and scuttle it, sets a fire to the match of the ship. And they get off the ship, but what they don't know is the powder magazine still had powder and ammunition in it. So the
Um,
fire is crackling on this ship, and as Reed and his men kind of row their way away from it, the whole thing blows to smithereens, right? The whole thing rocks the harbor, and this big, massive explosion hits. Fortunately, nobody is killed, nobody is wounded, and the regulars pick up these Confederates and haul them back to Fort Preble. And the townspeople march on the fort to demand, these guys are pirates, they're not. We demand you turn them over. And so the fort's commander writes to the authorities, basically in Washington, and says, "We need to get them out of Portland because if they stay here, I can't guarantee their safety. They may be lynched, if not, a whole lot worse. Their bodies can be thrown into the harbor." And so, kind of in the quiet of the night, the Confederates, Reed and his party, are sent to Fort Warren in Boston.
okay.
So the short-lived but rather fascinating story of the Battle of Portland Harbor, June 27th, 1863, is enough excitement for the city for the war for sure. Um, the wreck of the Caleb Cushing is known kind of like on ship charts. There's not a whole lot to it, right? This big thing blew up and the hull sank to the bottom. But definitely gave enough excitement for people who would climb to Munjoy Hill, which is the highest point of Portland, and they watched right this ship pursuit, and they watched as the Caleb Cushing blew to a million pieces. But yeah, Portland Harbor, the Battle of Portland Harbor. I talked about it, I wrote about it for the blog, and then those articles were posted in the book that you and Dwight Hughes put out, "The War on the Water." So if anyone wants more on that, they can get it there.
And when you first wrote for the blog, I was like, this is fascinating stuff. Like I hadn't even heard of it. And it just, why is it that it's something that people don't know about? I mean, I know it's small, but it's a fascinating little story.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I lived in Maine for the first 18 years of my life, and I quite literally never heard of it until I moved away from Maine.
Yeah.
I think I mentioned at the beginning, right? It happens 3 or 4 days before Gettysburg, and so you're reading all these papers about the rebel ship that's off the coast of Maine or whatever. That's interesting for maybe a day or two, but then it's very quickly eclipsed by the Battle of Gettysburg just happened, and here are the lists of casualties, and this, that, and the other. And oh, hey, there's this guy Chamberlain who did something, and isn't that interesting? Um, so yeah, I think the Battle of Pearl Harbor can't quite compete with the media presence that is the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah. I think to me, one of the fascinating implications of the battle, though, is that, um, it suggests that the war could really show up anywhere at any time, which is an unnerving thought, really, if you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a little outside of our scope, the conversation tonight, but you see that in other places too, right? The Confederates try to burn St. Albans, Vermont, in October 1864. So they try to burn New York City with fire. It's one of the few people actually hanged during the war for a guy named Kennedy was hanged for trying to burn New York City. So yeah, you have these kind of Confederate operatives coming down from Canada or being smuggled through the lines. They're definitely trying to find a way to bring the war outside of your traditional, Army One versus Army Two battlefield kind of concept, and move the war more irregularly underground. Sure.
Kind of thinking of a more modern analogy, one of the reasons Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City was like it could be anywhere, and so that sort of has a ripple effect to strike terror across the board instead of just assuming it's going to be in Washington or New York or something like that. It could be any small town or small city in America. And
Yeah.
so, to me, Portland struck me as that same sort of thing, like, oh my gosh, look, this is a lot closer than most people realize.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And it scares them too, right? You have people who are breathing down the neck of the Secretary of the Navy, right? Gideon Wells, or Lincoln calls him the Neptune of the sea. Uh, they're breathing down on Will's neck, right? They're saying, why can't you capture this guy? Like, this guy is causing absolute chaos along the East Coast. Are you telling me that one guy in a little ship is better than the entire United States Navy? And it's embarrassing to Wells, right? So he's more than a little. If you read his diary, he's more than a little relieved when Reed is captured and the threat is secured. Because yeah, it is embarrassing that this guy, 23 years old, right? He turns 23 during this voyage, sails from Brazil to Portland Harbor and dang near gets away with it. Almost gets away with it.
Wow. Now,
So
you mentioned earlier that when he first gets to Portland Harbor, he kind of tucks his original ship out of sight.
yeah.
Um, and then later on, as he's making his getaway after he's captured the Caleb, that like people are watching from Munjoy Hill. Tell me a little bit about the geography of Casco Bay and how you can see a ship, but you can also have a ship hidden. And I
Yeah.
think that the harbor lends itself to that kind of hide and seek.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Casco Bay, right? Portland feeds into Casco Bay is interesting because it's right off the Atlantic Ocean. So that's what's going to aid Portland to becoming a massive mercantile system. But it also has all these little islands, right? One of Maine's premier travel destinations is Peaks Island. Take a little ferry and you go out to Peaks for the day. An island this, an island that. And so you can almost hide behind these little islands. And then, I made reference earlier to a place called Portland Headlight, again, one of Maine's premier travel destinations. That's not far from Cape Elizabeth, right, which is another kind of jutting out. And so Casco Bay is almost like I know podcast is an audio visual, but imagine, if you will, take your hand and make a C with your left hand, like where your thumb meets your forefinger. That's almost where Portland is. And then your thumb is basically the rest of Casco Bay curling out around, and then all those little islands in the middle. So yeah, it is kind of easy to hide in plain sight, if you will, and then have to be, chased down by other people who are trying to capture you for sure.
Yeah. And so, that sea gives it a nice protected harbor, but immediate access to the ocean. I was just up there on Munjoy Hill. There's a big lighthouse there today, but I was there a couple weeks ago and, fog had rolled in off the ocean. And so that's another factor. I don't know if it played in this particular battle, but as soon as the fog rolls into the harbor and into the bay, I mean, stuff becomes invisible almost immediately.
Yeah, for sure. And that's to say nothing of the fact that, here we are in the middle of the 250th of the American Revolution. The British Navy very famously burns Portland in the fall of 1775, November of 1775. It was collectively known as Falmouth at the time, but if you read about the burning of Falmouth, that's Portland. Um, a few British ships under the command of a guy named Mowat, I think. I'm not a Revolutionary War historian. There's some British captain whose name starts with an M. Rob Orison can chase me down. They sail into Portland Harbor and they demand the surrender of the town, and they demand, all these rebels lay down their arms. And when they don't do that, the British turn their guns against Falmouth, Portland, and burn it down. Um, and so it is. Portland is not a unfamiliar with the concept of we could probably be attacked here pretty easily, which is why you start to see these forts pop up after the Revolution and after the War of 1812. Fort Preble, Fort Gorgas, idea to defend the harbor from any kind of mercantile threat if the British Navy were to attack again. The fact that Reed kind of rows his boat into Portland in the middle of the night, negates a lot of those forts. But had he tried to sail in and storm the place, it would have turned out a whole lot more bloody for him.
Yeah. Speaking of Rebel War history, that's actually what took me there because that's where John Adams had his meeting with John Sewell as Sewell tried to talk him out of going to the First Continental Congress. And so
Oh, okay.
working on my John Adams book and was there for that. But
Okay.
yeah, if someone were to go to the remains of Fort Preble today, what would they find?
Yeah, so the fort's modernized after the Civil War, right? So um, you learn all about these like third system forts and things like that. So what Fort Sumter is and Fort Pulaski. But after the Civil War, when they realized all these rifled guns are doing a whole lot worse to brick fortifications, they modernize them and they create cement bastions and disappearing batteries and things like that. So you can go to Fort Preble today, but it's not the fort of Civil War fame. It's the fort of the late 19th, early 20th century. I don't remember off the top of my head how long that was an active fort for. So you're going to see cement casements and things like that. So, but you can still go there. And like I mentioned a little earlier, it's quite literally next to the campus of the Southern Maine Community College, SMCC. So anybody can go, and there's a very nice weather. There's a nice little rock walkway out into the water, and brings you a pretty good view of the harbor for
Wow,
sure.
wow.
Yeah,
So what happens to Reed and his compatriots as they get shipped off to Fort Warren? Is there an end
yeah.
to their story?
So Fort Warren, for those of you who don't know, is in Boston Harbor. Reed remains a prisoner of war for about a year, maybe a little bit, a year and a half or so. He's exchanged in November '64, returns to the Confederate Navy, fights with the James River Squadron towards the end of the
Oh,
war, right? Kind of the last gasps of the Confederate Navy to do something on the James River. And then he goes back home to Mississippi when the war is over. So,
oh, okay.
yeah.
And the lieutenant commander of the Caleb Cushing, the guy from Georgia, what happens to
Yeah.
him? Is this a
Yeah. So
stain on his reputation? Because people thought he was turning sides.
yeah, that's the crazy thing is that he's initially held among the Confederate prisoners, which has got to be awkward for him, right? But the rest of the crew vouch for him and say, no, he didn't have a choice. He hid the key for the gunpowder magazine, so he's very quickly um, released from captivity, and his name is cleared. So no stain on his record. Um, but yeah, I have to imagine for a day or so it was real awkward in the prison cells at Fort Preble.
Yeah, I can just imagine him in his Georgia accent trying to convince everybody that no, I'm really.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean, yeah. I'm with you. Yeah, for sure.
So we have a second tale from Portland. This comes at the very tail end of the war and a little bit more of a civilian experience, but has a huge impact on the city. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So what I was kind of interested when you mentioned the city's theme of the symposium is thinking about the war a little outside the box, right? So the Civil War ends, and all these guys go home, and everyone's all happy. And what's one of the better ways to celebrate this newfound, right? The war is over, but Fourth of July, right? So, 4th of July, 1865, everyone's happy the war is over, but it's a little bit subdued, right? Lincoln had been assassinated just a couple months earlier. And so everyone's, celebrating, but kind of still down in the roughs. A year later, however, now we're in July 4th, 1866. The war is over. We're past it. Now we can throw ourselves a party. Um, and so what was supposed to be this big celebration, really for the first time significantly since before the war, turns into a catastrophe with the Great Portland Fire of July 4th, 1866. Um, we'll get into it for a second, but not to bury the lead. The fire will claim 1,800 buildings. It's going to leave about a third of the city homeless. The city's population about 30,000 in 1866. So 10,000 people will be left homeless by this fire, causes millions upon millions of dollars of damages. And it's kind of one of the country's first big great fires. If you think about, the Great Fire of Chicago or the Great Boston Fire, both of those were in the 1870s. And so the Portland Fire of 1866 is kind of the nation's first, at least the ones that grip the headlines, the first big fire that kind of captivates the nation's attention. Um, so that's kind of that's the 30-second elevator pitch of the Portland Fire for sure. Um, as
And
far as
and
we can,
like technically, Andrew Johnson hasn't declared the war over yet at this point, as I recall, right?
yeah,
So the war is still on. So this is a war story for us.
yeah, right. I mean, I don't think Andrew Johnson declares the rebellion over and done with until August. So yeah, this is a Civil War story.
Yeah. Now
Um,
you have interest in firefighting history. So before we kind of
yeah,
get into the details of the fire, but like so tell me how these two interests merge for you into this
yeah,
story.
yeah. So my dad is a firefighter. My grandfathers were firefighters. And so when I was a kid, everything every Halloween, and I had firefighter books and plastic helmets and all that. And my mom frequently joked that if I wasn't a firefighter, I owed her another childhood, right? Because I just played at one all of the time. And then she made a mistake of getting me a history book, and all bets were off. And so one of my interests has been the history of firefighting, specifically in the 19th century, right? How do we go from um, basically well-meaning volunteers, and a large percentage of United States firefighters are still volunteers. So all the credit to them. How do we go from volunteer firefighters in cities to more professionally paid fire departments? And Portland finds itself on the heels of that, or on the verge of that, with the fire of 1866. I think the other thing that ties all of this in, is September 11th, right? September 11th, 2001, an awful day, right? But in the midst of all that chaos, people saw firefighters and the police and the EMS running into the towers. I was 8 years old. And so I had to process that as an 8-year old did. And I ended up writing a postcard, a little letter to a New York City firehouse. And they were kind enough to write me a little postcard back. It's post dated February 2002, and I still have that postcard. One of my most cherished possessions, right? Because I look at that and you know, they were having a pretty awful time, but they set some time out to write back to an 8-year old kid. And so with the New York City Fire Department and all of that, kind of comes together. But that's my interest with my family interests, and kind of a literal moment in time that an 8-year old Ryan was trying to process his emotions through. So
Wow.
yeah,
Wow. That's a fantastic story. That is a
yeah,
fantastic story. A little connection that I have is Father Michael Judd, a judge who was the chaplain for the fire department in New York City. He had been at St. Bonaventure once upon a time. And so when he was killed, as the first civilian that was killed during 9/11 on the
yeah,
ground, it had a huge impact on us. And so that was so it was through the fire department that we sort of processed as a community the events of what was going on. So
sure,
I really
sure,
appreciate that kind of connection that you talk about there.
yeah,
So, so how did the story of the Great Fire of Portland come to light for you?
yeah. So as a way, my 40-hour week job is in the Civil War, right? And so when I go home, sometimes I don't want to think about Robert E. Lee or U.S. Grant or 1861. And so I try to find stories that mesh those interests together. Um, and Portland, I had read about the Portland fire a few times before, and there's a good book about Portland, specifically the fire department. It's called The Great Portland Conflagration, which I think is a good word. You want to win at Scrabble, use the word conflagration. Um, and so I started to do more research into it, and more work about it, and diving into the newspapers. And what I realized is that it really is a Civil War story, uh, a nation that still technically in war. Uh, Portland people and Mainers as a whole coming back from conflict, but now suddenly finding themselves right in the midst of turmoil. Civil War veterans who had proven their gallantry and their courageousness on the battlefield, now doing the exact same thing in the streets of Portland. That's kind of how it all kind of comes together. So I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet, but probably some kind of writing project of some kind,
Yeah.
to kind of highlight these stories. Not only the fire department, which fought a battle, a fire that had quite literally never seen before on that magnitude, but also the story of the average kind of Portlander who reacted to this threat. The fire burns all night, July 4th, before finally burning itself out in the early morning hours of July 5th. And so you look at these photographs of Portland, and it quite literally looks like a burned out city and a bombed out city. The comparison to Portland versus Richmond after the fire in April 1865, or Charleston after the fire in December 1861, they look the same, right? And so Portland has to react to this and rebuild itself, and it does very quickly. Portland kind of comes out of the Portland fire um, a new city, and it kind of charges into the 20th century headlong.
Yeah. Are there a lot of photographs of that? Because I think about the post Charleston fire in 1861, and the photos of the destruction are pretty stunning. A lot of people think that's from the war itself, but it's most of them are from that fire. Does Portland have that sort of documentation?
Absolutely, yeah. So a number of photographers kind of converged on Portland after in the days and weeks after the fire. Um, Probably the more kind of prominent is a guy named Soule, 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 who brought his camera up to the Naval Observatory at Munjoy Hill. So the highest point in Portland, the tallest structure, and he dragged that camera up all those steps, and he took a number of photos in each direction, which is really cool to have that kind of perception.
Yeah.
And then he brought the camera back down into the streets, and fortunately for us, he labeled the photographs. So he said, commercial street looking towards 4th Street or something. And so you can take those photos to their modern location and see, Gary Edelman is somewhere very happy. Then and now photographs, right? Um, and compare what Portland looked like in the days after the fire and how it rebuilds itself. Then and now photography, not just on the Civil War battlefield, but in the streets of Portland.
Wow. So how does the fire get started?
Yeah, as far as we can tell, some kid with a firecracker. uh, it's July 4th.
Let
There
that
was
be a
supposed to
lesson to
be,
you, you young whippersnappers.
yeah, pretty much. Don't play with firecrackers. Um, Big holiday. It was supposed to be a massive day. There was going to be a hot air balloon ascension, and that's what the old timey folks did for fun. Let's go watch the hot air balloon. Uh, there was going to be a baseball game, and everything just goes to crap real soon. The winds are too high for the balloon. The Portland baseball team just gets the crap kicked out of them. It was like 35-12. Um, and so it wasn't a great time. And so this kid, we don't know who he was. He's referred to in the newspapers as a youth, was playing with this firecracker down along the water in what is today the old port of Portland, and either drops it or flicks it or throws it or something, and it lands in the wood shavings of a boat repair shop. A guy named DeGuayo had a boat repair shop. And so as he repaired the ships and he painted them, there was varnish everywhere, and there's a little wood, little kindling from these shavings of ships. And the firecracker lands into that, and it flares up, right? Um, the fire goes undetected for a little bit. It's kind of smoldering, and then it gets that flash point, and the whole thing goes up. And before anybody really knows it, the whole block is on fire. And the person who is credited with first raising the alarm was a man named William Wilberforce Ruby, who was an
Jeez, you
African,
are full of great names. You're full of great
right?
names.
William Wilberforce Ruby, an African American who was born in to parents who were on the Underground Railroad, who named him for the British politician who ended slavery in Great Britain, right? William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce Ruby is walking along and sees this fire, and he starts to scream and shout. Um, Kind of a boy wish we'd done that sooner. The city of Boston had recently created a system of telegraphic alarms, right? So this whole city was chipped up, and all you had to do was flip a button or a box, as they're called, and that would trip a telegram alerting fire department officials where the fire was. Portland said that we don't need that. We don't have that many fires. We don't need to do that. Well, now here we are as this fire is going on. The only way to alert people that there was a fire was the city was divided into districts. And wherever there was a fire, the churches of that district would ring their bells, right? And that would tell the fire department where the fire was. But kind of common fire science philosophy is an untamed fire grows in size, twice in size, every 60 seconds. So if you don't contain a fire, every 60 seconds it will double in size. So by the time the fire department does learn about it and gets onto the scene, the fire has been burning for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and they are very quickly outmatched. Portland had 5 steam engines, so modernized engines that could throw water farther and faster. But because they can throw water farther and faster, their water supply were these reservoirs in the city. The tide was out, so they couldn't draw from the ocean, and they very quickly exhaust these reservoirs. And as the water drains out, your fire engine is useless, and it has to bounce from each different reservoir. So the firefighters weren't putting the fire out per se, but more redirecting the fire with their hoses, redirecting it onto buildings that were already on fire, and they were basically stopping the spread, which is a valid strategy, right? If you can't put it out, at least stop it from where it's spreading. Um, Another firefighting strategy of the time was to create fire breaks. sacrifice buildings for the greater good. And so somebody has the great idea of introducing barrels of gunpowder into the mix. We're going to blow those houses down and create a fire block.
Oh,
So this is where we get kind of our first Civil War story. Um, who wants to be the? I need a show of hands, right? I got a barrel of gunpowder. I need you to walk it into this building that's already on fire and light the fuse. And people are like, "Are you crazy? I'm not doing that." And up comes this guy named Fred Jones, who had served in the Maine regiment, the name of which escapes me at the moment, but he served in the Red River campaign in Louisiana. And he was actually breveted for gallantry. He was a company grade officer, and he's breveted twice during the Red River campaign. So he's like, "Give me the thing." And he walks in and he does the gunpowder and he blows the house up. And he's credited with saving an entire block of Portland. Um, the biggest problem is the fire spreads from that boat shop I was mentioning to a sugar factory. About 2.5 blocks up
mhm.
from the boat shop was Brown's Sugar Refinery. It was a massive 3 or 4 story structure, and it had barrels upon barrels upon barrels of molasses and raw sugar and syrup. So the fire gets to that, and it just completely turns into a firestorm. That's where we have the emergence of that conflagration I was mentioning, right? A
Yeah.
firestorm blows through that, and then it's anybody's ball game. Um, and so it just kicks off with that sugar factory.
Wow. Wow. So,
So
yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, geez, you got the ocean right there. Why can't they just tap into that? So, kind
yeah,
of fascinating that, they're using these reservoirs because they can't tap into the ocean there. Do
yeah.
they learn anything from that long term? Do you know?
Yeah, for sure. So if you know Maine very well, you know there's a place called Sebago Lake, not very far from Portland. And so in the years after the Civil War, there's a cat who wants to be part of the conversation. In the years after the Civil War, they install long-range piping from Sebago Lake.
Okay.
And to this day, maybe not necessarily those same pipes, but to this day, Sebago Lake funnels the water used by Portland Fire Department. They go into the
Oh,
hydrants to this day. But that's of course lessons learned. Fire department installs telegraphic alarm boxes because lesson learned, and they install this piping from Sebago Lake that will now um, help out with the Portland Fire Department. What I think is so interesting is too, it's a story of mutual aid because you have all these towns around Portland. They're having their July 4th parade. What do you do in the July 4th parade? You pull out the old fire engine and you
right.
carry it down the street, right? Well, a lot of these towns don't have fire engines. They have these like hand pump operating. And they're walking down the parade route when they hear, oh my God, 10 miles, 15 miles down the road, Portland's on fire. And so these volunteer firefighters load these, fire apparatus onto trains or whatever and haul ass, if I can say that, down to
Yeah.
Portland. And they show up and these guys from Biddeford and Gardner, which are further north from Portland, they show up and they save the day, right? There's a fire company that shows up from Gardner, and they're credited with saving the kerosene factory. If the sugar factory
Ooh.
wasn't bad enough, how about the kerosene factory? So these guys show up and they're the old lever action where every time a guy would push down on a pedal, that would push the water out. Well, here come these guys and they show up and they save the kerosene factory. So it's a story of Portland, but it's also a story of Mainers helping Mainers, right? Realizing there's a problem, rushing to the problem and saving the day for sure.
Wow. And I think about like getting to Portland from Biddeford, like we can do that on the turnpike today, and it still takes 45 minutes. But like so imagine doing that back then without the turnpike.
Yeah, yeah. They're getting on flax car trains and they're making their quick way as quickly as possible. But you got to imagine, right? You get to the horizon, it's the middle of the night, and the whole thing's on fire. How do you
Right.
even begin to comprehend that? But somehow, miraculously, only 4 people are known to have died in the Great Fire. You would think much higher. Now I say known because I was talking to somebody once, and they had a really good point. Portland, as an international city, had merchants coming in and out all the time. So, was there a merchant who no one knew got killed in the fire? Yeah, maybe. But there are 4 known residents of the city of Portland who were killed in the fire. If it hadn't been July 4th, that number may have been higher because so many people left the city for the holiday. So they lose their house, but they don't lose their life, which is kind of miraculous with the Portland fire.
Wow. Now, you said that the fire has to burn itself out. So how do they realize that it's finally kind of under control? It's spinning itself out. Why doesn't it just keep going?
Yeah, so we go back to that C analogy I used way earlier, right? So the fire basically burns its way up your kind of forefinger, if you will, and it gets to Munjoy Hill, which we've mentioned a few times now. And at the base of Munjoy Hill was a massive sand bank, right? And so this massive sand bank proves to be the badly needed fire break that the fire burns itself out in. So it had engulfed and destroyed 1,800 buildings, left 10,000 people homeless. But when it got to that sandbank, it finally burned itself out in the early morning hours of July 5th. So the whole thing's on fire for 14, 15 hours. But
Wow.
then in the recovery effort, you read these newspapers in September and October of 1866, so 3, 4, 5 months later, and they talk about the embers of the city or the bricks of the city are still too hot to touch, right? Because they retained so much heat that was radiating as these guys were trying to pick up things, which
Yeah.
gives you an idea of just how hot this fire was before it burned out.
Wow. Wow. So, Munjoy Hill today, big neighborhood. The observatory is still up there. I think I referred to it as a lighthouse earlier. You
Yeah.
can still go to the observatory and get that beautiful panorama. Was that neighborhood there at the time? So that,
It wasn't as built up at the time, but the observatory was. The
yeah,
Naval Observatory dates to the early 19th century. So ironically enough, there's a fire department, right, a fire station right next to the Naval Observatory, which I think is
yeah,
kind of funny. But yeah, there was a neighborhood there. We have sketches of the city before the fire, and you can see houses up there. Again, wasn't as populated, obviously, as it is now. Um, the city of Portland in 1860, 1865, about 30,000 people. Today it's about 70,000. So it's doubled since the
yeah.
Civil War, but yeah, you have a residency up there for sure.
Wow, wow. So the fire burns itself out. There's some lessons learned. You talk about the city rebuilding itself pretty quickly afterwards. If someone were to visit Portland today, are there traces, are there signs, are there places you can visit that kind of tell this story at all?
Yeah, so the city has definitely done a lot. Yeah, so I guess this was been 2016, right? The 150th of the anniversary of the fire. They put on a big commemoration. There are some buildings.
No fireworks is part of that, though, I
No,
imagine.
definitely not, right? Uh, they marked buildings that survived the fire. And then even just a couple weeks ago, not months, but weeks ago, a musical or an operetta was debuted in Portland about the fire. So
Oh,
the city has an interesting way of dealing with the fire, and they have little stones throughout the city. As you walk around, you can basically follow a history path of the city, and it will point out prominent buildings. One of them was an African American church, which William Wilberforce Ruby, after discovering fire, ran over to this church. And the public lore is that the building survived the fire because the congregation threw buckets of water on the roof all night and then tamped it down with wet blankets. So there are structures you can go to which survived the fire and have this lore. Um, it's kind of funny. One of the prominent restaurants in the old port is Becky's Diner,
yeah.
which in Maine parlance is Becky's Dinah.
Dinah.
Um, the slogan of that is nothing finer, right? Which is, gotta love that Maine accent. Becky's
Yeah.
Diner is about where the boat shop was. It's not terribly
Okay.
far from where the boat shop was. So if you go down into the old port, you would have been in the heart of the fire. Where it gets interesting, kind of reel it back to the Civil War, is two things happen, right? One, townspeople start to ask for help, and Montgomery Meigs, Quartermaster General of the U.S. Army, says, "Huh, let me get this straight. You need a bunch of tents and equipment because your city burned down. The war ended, and I have this stockpile of stuff in Washington." So he's able to very quickly respond to that need, and
Oh, wow.
thousands of tents were very quickly sent to Portland because they weren't needed anymore, right? And there was no army that needed these tents anymore, so they'd been returned to DC warehouses. The other thing that gets interesting is newspapers throughout the country start to raise awareness for the fire and raising funds for the victims of the fire. And you'll see those newspapers in New York and in Pennsylvania and even further west in Washington or Oregon, not in the South. Uh, there are
Okay.
newspapers in Virginia and in South Carolina uh, which can basically be read as, "Is this a joke? You want us to give money
Mm.
to the city of Portland because it caught on fire? Isn't that cute?"
Gee.
Um, so there's one South Carolina newspaper that even goes even harder, and it talks about how the so-called depredations of Maine soldiers, and it doesn't call them the Maine battalions; it calls them the mean battalions. So you have this very national reaction to these fires. Northern people donating tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The Civil War is still, again, still definitely hasn't ended, but this is a tight and sore wound. So these southern newspapers are reacting with some pretty good vitriol. If you want to talk about like the memory of the conflict,
Yeah.
they politely declined to fund the relief organization.
They're still asking for money to pay for the Great Atlanta Fire of 1864, right?
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much, yeah. Or Columbia, South Carolina, they're
Right.
they're not they're not sending money to Portland.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So if we kind of put this in the context of the two other fires that you mentioned earlier, the Great Boston Fire and the Great Chicago Fire, um, what sort of innovations result because suddenly people realize just how vulnerable these large cities are to these large fires?
yeah, unfortunately, um, they're not learned. Lessons aren't learned as quickly as they should have been, right?
Yeah.
Boston, which happened just a few years after Portland, they have a doubly rough because a lot of their horses being used to drag their fire engines had a disease, so they couldn't respond adequately enough to the fire. The Chicago fire, a couple years after that, has the double problem of there were multiple great Chicago fires. So even if it's not necessarily the city of Portland being a learning ground, fire departments as a whole were learning how to deal with these big problems. And another Civil War connection to that is the New York City Fire Department is established in August of 1865. And for a couple of years, it was kind of rudderless. It didn't really know what it was doing. And um, a commissioner was appointed to kind of oversee the New York City Fire Department in the late 1860s. And his name was Alexander Shaler. He's yeah, there we go. There's that recognition. He gets the Medal of Honor for the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, just a few blocks from where I am currently. He was, no nonsense. Everything's got to be. So he gets brought into the New York City Fire Department, and he really shapes that thing up. Um, if you've ever wondered why fire departments have military ranks, like a captain or a lieutenant, you can thank Alexander Shaler.
Yeah.
Shaler introduces military ranks to the FDNY to reorganize them. He puts his fire crews through physical fitness, and one person likens it to the Army service, and he says the members of the engine were as trained as a gun crew was on a cannon. Um, where I'm getting at is Shaler is asked to go to Chicago after the fire and say, "What can you teach us?" Right? Like, clearly, you've got things going pretty good in New York. What can you teach us? And so Shaler's methods start to grow, and so the concept of a professional fire department takes hold. Cincinnati, Ohio, they're ahead of the game. They have the nation's first paid fire department in 1853, right? But New York City, Portland, Chicago, they're learning these lessons and they're definitely learning from it. So Civil War people, Civil War lessons, they're coming out of the war and they're basically asking themselves, well, now what do we do? Let's go fight some fires.
Wow. Wow. So before we wrap up, any final thoughts you want to share with folks, either about the battle or the fire?
I would just say, as a symposium as a whole, right? You don't have to be a big city on the war front to be a war story. Um, Stories like this are instrumental for us to understand the periphery of the conflict, right? Not everything has to be a Fredericksburg or a Gettysburg. It can be on the periphery, and those stories are valid too. Um, I think they're endlessly fascinating. Maybe one person out there is like, I don't really care about fire engines, but I do, right? Even today, I'll be driving down the road. And I'm like, that's a fire engine. Um, and there's a quote that lives kind of rent free in my mind from Kurt Vonnegut, right? Who says, uh, there is no more and no more enduring symbol of man's humanity to man than a fire engine. Um, and so the idea of like you're looking for helpers in these times of chaos, and you can do that at a big Civil War battlefield too. The nurses and the doctors who rush to help too. So I think that those stories can be brought to the front too.
Yeah,
So
yeah. You think about Vonnegut surviving the firebombing of Dresden, and for him to say that, I mean,
yeah,
he's a guy who knew fires, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think
Wow.
I'll trust him at his word.
Yeah. Ryan, thanks so much for spending some time talking about our home state there, pal.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. On behalf of my good friend Ryan Quint, thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.